This week on Cyber School, we're going to continue our segment or series on demystifying overhead paging. And specifically, we're going to be talking about zoned paging today. Paging itself, and especially just dealing with zoned paging, adds further complication and potentially further confusion to understanding a paging system. And today, hopefully, we can kind of build on and expand on what we covered in our last session and just kind of understanding overhead paging and building into a zoned system, which at its core, it should be a little bit simple, but it can be a little bit more complicated just depending on how the particular system works. So before we get into that, we really kind of need to understand what is a zone, so that way we can better understand the context of how to page in a zoning environment. So a zone is just a specific area that's going to be covered by a paging system. You can think of it as, just a specific general area that you would like to contain the pages in. An example that I helped on today is a school that's looking for paging in 9 different classrooms in their hallway. So each of those different 9 classrooms would be a zone as well as the hallway. Then, of course, an additional one is going to be another zone referred to as an all call or an all page. But basically, every single area is going to be a zone. Even if we're dealing with, say, just a single zone where you're paging everywhere, that's still a zone. It's just one zone instead of specific zones that you could be dealing with. Anywhere that you're going to be doing paging is a zone. Sometimes there are more than one zones, but there's always going to be one at a minimum. So now that we kind of understand what a zone is in the paging context, how do you determine what the number of zones are? How do you kind of figure this number out to determine, the kind of hardware that you might need or how to handle a particular paging system? So, the kind of root question that we're trying to address is how many areas are going to need specific paging or announcements? And there's a couple different examples that we can kind of go through to help give somebody an idea on, what these different zones could be. In a very simple method, thinking of, say, like a shop, you've got your front of house and your back of house. That would be 2 zones. Say, for example, in something like a CyberData situation where we can page to our production area, page to our office area, and page to our parking lot. Really, the possibilities are going to be endless because they're unique to every specific situation where, for example, front of house and back of house might work for some situations, but a school, that doesn't necessarily work, and you might need something that's a little bit more complex. So everything's going to be different and unique to each particular location. But the basic formula, because it all boils down to some kind of a math formula, is the number of zones, the total number of areas that you need paging in, plus 1. And that plus 1 is going to accommodate for an all page, or any case where you need to page to all of your zones together, would basically be a good, easy way to think about it. You basically got n plus 1, where n is the number of zones. So now that we kind of understand, the number of zones, what zones are, how do you actually page to these different zones? Well, there's really 2 different ways that you can do it in kind of the analog world. You can either have individual amplifiers per zone. So say you've got one amplifier that goes to the front of house and a whole separate amplifier that goes to the back of house. And this is pretty standard and a good option for some areas, but there's another option that you can do where certain specific amplifiers, and these are usually, a little bit more pricey, fancier amplifiers, actually have the capability and the circuitry built into them to be able to wire different zones all up to a specific amplifier. And one key one that we run into quite a bit, because it's a very popular amplifier that's still sold today, is a Bogen PCM 2000. It's very, very popular because it has selectable zones via DTMF, or basically dial tones that you can actually send through your particular device to the amplifier that recognizes that and selects a particular zone. Both of these are going to be common. There's not really, say, more of one or the other. It's, probably about 50-50 between the 2 because they both have their advantages and disadvantages. Individual amplifiers per zone definitely allows you for more wattage per zone, but at the end of the day, that's going to require different interfaces for each individual physical zone. So say, for example, you've got those 2 zones that we've been kind of talking about, your front of house and your back of house. You would need 2 interface devices, one for each particular zone and one for each amplifier. So, you could potentially be looking at more potential interface points to the entire system. You're trading that off for more wattage capability. So say if you've got a big production facility, it might be more economical instead of buying, a very expensive amplifier system that is multi-zone, but can use the wattage, you can buy potentially a cheaper single zone amplifier with the amount of wattage that you need for the front of house and one for the back of house. So you might be able to save money that way. Now, if we look at the single amplifier option, they're going to require less parts because you'll have that one specific tie-in point to the entire system because one amplifier is looking for that DTMF zone selection, but it's going to have that more complicated dialing pattern. So if we go back to our example of front of house and back of house, with our single zone or single amplifier per zone, you've basically got, say, for conversation's sake, extension 100 to dial front of house and 101 to dial the back of house. Relatively simple and easy to understand in terms of paging capability. But say if you did that same thing with a single zone amplifier, you would dial say 100 to dial the amplifier, and then you would have to dial, say, 01 for front of house and 02 for back of house. So it makes it slightly more complicated. Instead of having, say, a distinctive extension number for each particular zone, you've got a single one, and then you have to select the zone. So it could potentially be a little bit more complicated to actually go and interface with these different zones. So which option of these is going to be more common? It really honestly kind of depends on the use case. I did say that they're kind of 50-50 again, because it deals specifically with the use cases. When we're dealing with schools and kind of smaller businesses, say, something that would be, akin to like, say, a small mom and pop shop or, like a small grocery store, it's probably going to be a single amplifier that can handle multiple zones, especially for schools. That's going to be more common. That's why we run into that Bogan PCM 2000 that I referenced quite a bit. They're very popular with schools because they can handle a whole bunch of different zones and really good capability for paging there. And smaller businesses can do the same. But when you're dealing with multiple sites, say specific business, like different buildings at a school, or larger businesses, they're probably going to have individual amplifiers per building. And in that building, they might say, just be a single gigantic zone, or they might be individual zones per the specific building. Say if you've got a high school that has multiple different buildings and they've got, say, the science area, the math building, this, the like English and history building or what have you, they might have an individual Bogan PCM 2000, a zoning amplifier per one of those buildings. Whereas, say, a large enterprise level business that just, say, has a couple different warehouses spread out, they might have a single zone amplifier for each one of those different businesses. So it's really going to depend on the specific use case, and there's really no right answer to say if you want, say, a single zone amplifier or a multi-zone amplifier. So how does a zoned amplifier actually go and select these different zones? Well, a zoned amplifier is going to use DTMF tones to actually select a zone, where we've all dealt with, say, entering your voicemail password on your cell phone, for those of us that actually listen to voicemails or even leave voicemails, or different options out there, or say you're interacting with something like a CyberData intercom, you're going to be entering those DTMF tones on your phone's keypad to select your relay open code. And the same thing works for selecting a zone with a particular analog amplifier. And it's going to vary between the different amplifiers. Some of them require 2-digit codes for a particular zone, say 01 for zone 1, 02 for zone 2, so on and so forth. It varies. Sometimes they're single digit. It's all down to the specific manufacturer of that. And then, of course, as we get a little bit more complicated, we talk about combining zones. They're going to have different specific dialing patterns for that as well. The one downside to going with a zoned amplifier is just because of the way that the device is manufactured, they have a hard limit on the number of zones that specific amplifier supports. Say if you've got a amplifier that only supports 3 zones. The key one that comes to mind is a Valcom 2003A. That one supports 3 zones and our +1 to make a total of 4 because it can page to all 3 zones simultaneously. You can't really go around that. You can't have, say, a Valcom 2003A and add in, say, a 4th or a 5th physical zone because there are no more physical outputs for that particular zone to tie into. So when you're dealing with a zoned amplifier, that is one potential limitation that you can run into, is just because there's a hard limit on the number of physical outputs from that specific amplifier. So How do you select a zone when we're dealing with multiple amplifiers? We're kind of dealing with that other case that I was talking about where we've got an amplifier for front of house and one amplifier for front of and back of house. So when you're dealing with a specific zone, it makes it very, very simple, where you've got, say, extension number 100 for zone 1 and 200 for zone 2. Very, very simple. You've got those distinct different directory numbers or extension numbers to dial for that particular amplifier and that physical zone. But paging to multiple zones can be a little bit more complicated because something like, say, a paging group, which can be a feature of a phone system, isn't supported on all phone systems. And that's where another protocol known as multicast can come in and be used to page to different interface devices, like something you might get from CyberData or a multitude of other manufacturers out there, to be able to page to these different physical zones. And that would just be using the existing network hardware by utilizing an open source standard or protocol that most manufacturers support being multicast. A whole other option, and it's very popular with schools, is different emergency notification software suites. A key one that we run into and is kind of a big partner for CyberData and a big option that we encounter a lot with schools is Single Wires Informacast is a really big emergency notification suite that can help assist in paging the different physical amplifiers when you've got zones that are split up in that particular manner, meaning a physical amplifier per each physical zone. So what is a zoned overhead paging system? Well, a paging system is going to consist of one or more zones. That's basically, at a nutshell, that's going to be a zoned overhead paging system. It's just one that has, any more than one zone. Technically, an all page single zoned paging system is a zoned paging system. It only has one zone. And these zones are going to be controlled either by a single amplifier or many amplifiers. And as we've discussed today, there's really no benefit in going either direction. Both have their advantages and disadvantages. Zone selection can, of course, get complicated at scale, especially when you're dealing with, say, 10 different zones. It's a little complicated depending on how you can actually go and interact with those and the different combinations of all those particular zones. And zone selection can, of course, be controlled by using an analog amplifier or in an IP-based fashion with something like a paging group if it's provided by your phone system, or multicast, which is an open source protocol that's used by a multitude of telecom equipment manufacturers. In our upcoming segments, we'll talk a little bit more about paging in an IP-based fashion and kind of expand and talk about what an overhead paging system is in the IP world. So as we transition away from an analog-based paging system, we can get in and explain a little bit more about an IP-based system.
Thank you for watching this edition of Cyber School. If you have any questions, please get in contact with our sales department. They are available by email at sales@cyberdata.net or by phone at 831-373-2601 extension 334. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe for more content like this from CyberData.